Hello and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to be discussing about full stack development and basically how the web works. So, full stack development can be divided into two major parts. The first part is the client side, which we can also call the front end, and the other part of it is what we know as the back end, which we can call the server side. Do you understand? So, any of this is okay. Can refer to the backend and the server side, and we can refer to it as the backend. So backend or server side, backend or server side. So we are going to discuss about each of them individually. Then we are going to discuss about how the client side communicates with the server side. So first of all, we have to further explore the different categories of front end that we have. So when we say front end is quite massive and it is wide. So let's divide it into the several categories. So we have web, we have iOS, we have Android, Android devices, right? And we have desktop. So when we say front end, when we hear the word front end, or when we hear people say client side, what they are really referring to or what they are talking about is what we can see. And what we can see is what we call the interface. So the interface. So the front end development has to do with interface. So front end development is just like saying interface development. Do you understand? Just like I'm using this app called Krita. So Krita, as you can see, is like a drawing software for like drawing art and all of that. Or at the moment, I'm using to create just like the whiteboard scenery in this case. So with the help of the developer, you can see that I can click several buttons for different functionalities. That's exactly what front end is all about. It's all about creating the interface. And when you talk about interface development, it means creating what the users would see and interact with. For this lecture, we are going to be focusing on WhatsApp. So WhatsApp is what we are going to be focusing on. I said front end can be divided into about four categories. So I mentioned iOS, I mentioned web, I mentioned Android and desktop. So when you look at iOS, right, WhatsApp is available on iOS devices, right? So we have WhatsApp or iOS devices and we can get them from the App Store, the Apple App Store, and we have web WhatsApp. We can access that from thinkweb.whatsapp.com, right? So yeah, for Android, we can get it on Play Store, and for Play Store, and for the desktop version can be downloaded on Microsoft or can basically download it online, right? So now we know that front end has to be with interface development, right? And we can see that WhatsApp, for instance, is available on iOS, it's available on web, it's available on Android, and it's available on desktop. There's desktop version of WhatsApp. So all of these versions is still interface development. That is, the people who develop these softwares, right, are people we refer to as front-end developers. But how did they develop it? One thing we know now is that client side or front end simply means interface development. That is developing the buttons, everything we can see, developing the components. It has to do with a lot more than this, but the major part is developing the components, the buttons, and every other thing that we can see. So that's what front end is. That's what front end development is, right? So we know we have iOS, that is somebody that develops an iOS application is a front end developer. Someone that develops web interfaces is a front end developer. Somebody that develops Android applications, the apps we use on our Android phones, is a front end developer. And somebody that develops on for desktop is also a front end developer. So now we know what the front end developer is. They're in charge of um building up the components, the buttons, and everything that we see on the interface, right? On the interface, basically everything that we see. So now we know this. Now, the next thing I would like to introduce to us is that what tools and technologies are used for development of these interfaces, right? We know that an iOS developer is a front-end developer, but what tool and technology does he use to create these interfaces? So for iOS, we have Flutter. So Flutter is a framework for that. I'll explain what a framework is in a bit. So we have Flutter. Flutter is one of it. We have Swift. Do you understand? So now when we say something is a framework, so Flutter here is a framework, right? Flutter is a framework, is a that framework. So when we say something is a framework, so a framework like this. So Flutter is a framework, right? Flutter is a framework, but the programming language itself is that. Do you understand? So when we say something is a framework, it means that for this framework to exist, we must first have the programming language because the framework is built on top of the programming language. So without the programming language, the framework cannot exist. So Flutter is a framework for building iOS application. Actually, Flutter is used to build cross-platform applications. So when we say cross-platform, what does that mean? So when we say something is cross-platform simply means that it can be used to build um applications across different platforms. So what is a platform? A platform is where an application is going to run in this case. So we have iOS, just like I mentioned, we have web, we have Android, and yeah. So these are like three platforms, right? These are three platforms. So when we say a particular framework is a cross-platform framework, it means that when we develop an application using that particular framework, for instance, like we've said before, Flutter is a cross-platform framework. So it means that when we develop an application with Flutter, it automatically generates code for all three platforms. That is, when we write a single code, when we develop, let's say we develop a simple application like a delivery app now. Let's say we develop something like GoCada. You understand? So if we develop GoCada now, we develop this application, right? But automatically, if we use Flutter, it will generate the iOS code for us, the web code, and Android. Do you understand? All we need to do is just write a single code, like a single code, right? All we need to do is just single development, but automatically we would get a web version, an iOS version, and an Android version of that same application. You get automatically. So that's why we call Flutter a cross-platform framework because when you write a single code or when you develop a single application, it automatically generates that same application for different platforms for iOS, for web, and for Android. So depending on what you need, for instance, some people would develop an iOS application and they would not want to develop an Android version of it. So all they'll be interested in is just going to be the iOS. So basically, we have learned about Flutter, right? So Flutter is one of the technologies iOS developers use. Just like I've explained, it's a cross-platform framework, which means that Android developers also use Flutter. You understand? So Flutter is a tool used for building iOS application, and Swift is also another tool. So now we move to the Android. So Android, since we've learned about Flutter, so Flutter is also used in building Android applications. Just like I've explained that when you write a single Flutter code, or when you build an application using Flutter, it automatically generates code for iOS, Android, and web. Do you understand? So Flutter is one of the tools used. And then we have Kotlin. So Kotlin. So Kotlin is another programming language used in developing Android applications. So when you see WhatsApp on Android or your mobile application or banking or whatever application you see, there is this high possibility that the technology used was Kotlin or Flutter. Do you understand? And definitely you have other technologies that are used for building these apps. But I'm just trying to call your attention to the most popular ones. Then we have web. So this is the most popular category of front-end development, right? All of these are categories under front-end development. We already know what front-end development is all about. It's all about interface development. But now we are talking about like the subcategories of front-end. So most people think web front-end developers are only front-end developers. Do you understand? So some people don't know that okay, somebody that develops an iOS app is also a front-end developer, or somebody that develops an Android app is also a front-end developer. The only people they recognize as front-end developers are the people that develop the front end of a website or a web page, right? Or a web app. So let's now talk about the technologies used by web front-end developers. So this one are basically they are very, very common. You have HTML, you have CSS, you have JavaScript, JS. We have so now JavaScript itself, just like that in this case. I said that is a programming language. So JavaScript itself is a programming language. So we have several JavaScript framework. We have React JS, we have Vue.js, we have Angular, and so on for front-end development, right? So don't forget that front-end development is the same, but it depends on where you want it to run. The platform is what differs, right? So you're going to develop a front-end application for a web app, right? Something like web WhatsApp or other web apps, right? I'm going to use these technologies. So now finally, we divided it into four subcategories: iOS, web, Android, and desktop. The last part is desktop. So for desktop development, so I'm just going to write that down here. And I apologize for the messy screen. So desktop development, we use Electron.js. So Electron.js is just one of the most popular JavaScript framework used for desktop app development. Well, it doesn't mean it is the only one. There are several others, but I'm just trying to mention the most popular ones and the most common ones. So now that we know about the tools and technologies used in developing the front end, in the next lecture, we're going to discuss about how the front end communicates with the back end. So we've learned about client type, the technologies used, and what front-end development is all about. So we are going to move ahead to how does the client side communicate with the server side, and how does the server side communicate with the client side, and what does the server side really have to offer. All of this will be discussed in the coming lectures. See you in the next lecture. Bye.